Handouts. We've got handouts this morning. Yeah, just about.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Had to cover last week and this week.
Okay.
There we are.
Hello, John.
Good morning. Good. Hi, Marilyn. Reading material board.
Okay. Thank you.
There we are. Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. I am glad that you are here. We are continuing our study of the book of Revelation. And for those of you who are at home watching, we are glad that you're joining us as well. This is actually our third class, but there's been such a demand from people around the country to tune in, if you will, that we are. Here, let me keep one. Okay. So I know what I'm talking. There we are. That we are broadcasting on YouTube today, so you can watch. Now, I have just passed out a handout to everybody here, and on the 7 churches of Asia. If you would like a copy of that, I'll be happy to email one or mail one to you if you'll just drop me a line. Just send the email to john@johnmckeel.com, and we will get that to you right away. Now, what we've covered in the first 2 classes, in class number 1, we talked about, let's see, I have to move this way. In class number 1, we talked about the 2 keys to understanding, 2 keys to unlocking the book of Revelation. Number 1 is to understand the kind of literature that we're dealing with. Just as you use a different standard of interpretation to read poetry than you do to read history, so depending on what book of the Bible, there are different types of literature in the Bible, just like there are different types of literature in reading a newspaper. And the type of literature of the book of Revelation is very unique. It's called apocalyptic literature. We see a couple of passages in the Old Testament that are that way. It is the only piece of apocalyptic literature in the New Testament. Apocalyptic literature is very much like a political cartoon. There are a series of word pictures, and we saw in our first class, the first word picture was the picture of Jesus in his heavenly glory walking among the 7 lampstands. And the letters to the 7 churches of Asia that follow will all be based on that vision in chapter 1. So understanding the kind of literature that we're dealing with is very, very important to unlocking the book of Revelation. The second key is to read the book against its historical and geographical and archaeological background. The more we know about the people who first received the book and their circumstances, it will help us to interpret the book. So those are our 2 keys. That was our first class. In last week's class, we talked about the letters to the 7 churches. So let's review that. Here's the first vision. I turned to see the voice that was speaking. On turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man. Now, who's the Son of Man? It's Jesus, all right? Jesus. This head were eyes were like flames of fire. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in full strength. So here we have the first of the word pictures. It's a bold picture. And we ask ourselves, well, what does this mean? And to understand that, we look at the letters to the 7 churches. In each of these letters, they follows an outline, a pattern. It begins with the address as Jesus describes himself, and then there is a description of Christ followed by a commendation the things that they are doing right, and then a condemnation, the things that are not right, a warning about what will happen if they don't fix what's wrong, then an exhortation, and it always concludes with a promise. So we'll look at 7 letters. Now, you can see beginning in Ephesus, which is down in the lower left-hand corner, is where the cycle of letters begins. That's the first church that was addressed. Important church. Not only we have the letter to the Ephesians by the Apostle Paul, but its history. You remember Priscilla and Aquila started the church there. They kind of got things going, and then the Apostle Paul came and established the church. The first Christian school was there at Ephesus, and then after Paul left, Apollos, the eloquent Alexandrian, wordsmith himself, came and preached there. And following Apollos came Timothy, Paul's protege, and we have Paul's letters to Timothy as he's preaching there in Ephesus. And following that came the Apostle John, who also worked there. So this is a congregation that has been highly blessed. And so the letter begins in Ephesus. And then we follow a circular mail route. We'll go north up to Smyrna. Remember that Smyrna is the most important of the cities today. It's Izmir, which is the most important port in all of Turkey today in the story. We go around to Pergamum at the far north. Pergamum was the capital city, and that's where we left it off last week. As the capital city, the governor there had the power of the sword. But you remember the picture that we just read a minute ago of Jesus? He has a sword coming out of his mouth, and the sword that comes out of the mouth of Jesus is a battle sword. He's the one who has the real power. So let's pick up the story now as we come to Thyatira. Now what is interesting, this is the longest of the 7 letters, but historically it's the church we know the least about. We do know something of it from the New Testament. Do you remember any other place that Thyatira is mentioned in the New Testament?
Acts chapter 16.
Acts chapter 16 is right. That is, who's the famous person from Thyatira? It's early. Marilyn, would you go to the kitchen and bring us, let's see, about 10 cups of coffee? We'll get everybody going again. All right, who was from Thyatira?
Seller of purple, what's her name?
What's her name? Lydia. Yeah, Lydia, the seller of purple from Thyatira. The first convert in Philippi, the first convert in Europe on Paul's second missionary journey. So very, very important. Now, what was Lydia's, we're getting into trivia. What was Lydia's occupation? She was a seller of purple. A seller of purple. Now, that is the famous export of Thyatira. Let's back up a little bit. We need to talk about the fashions of the time. Purple is the royal color. In order to, in the ancient world, to get purple dye, you have to get a little snail. And there is a little drop of purple from a gland of the Murex snail, I believe, and it takes an awful lot of snails to make enough dye to dye your robe purple. But that's the royal color. That is the color that the emperor wore. His robes were purple. For senators, they had a purple stripe. Maybe you remember the movies that you've seen about Rome. They have a purple stripe, and that marks royalty. Purple is the color that everybody wants. But because it is so rare, it was so incredibly expensive. Most people couldn't afford purple. They want purple, but they can't afford purple. Along comes the ingenious Thyatirans. Now, Thyatira is surrounded by a marsh country, and there are reeds that grow in this marsh, and if you grind up that reed and process it properly, it makes an artificial purple. Now, it's a great purple dye, but it fades quickly over time, all right? But because you can get it easily, it was inexpensive. And everybody wanted purple, and this is the purple that we could afford. And so Lydia goes all the way to Philippi, where, remember that Philippi is a Roman colony? And the Romans in Philippi want to dress like the Romans in Rome. And so purple is the color. She had a thriving business with purple, an inexpensive Thyatira purple, and so she's doing very well. So the little city of Thyatira is important in that regard. Now notice that Thyatira is between Sardis, which was a capital city, and Pergamum, which was a capital city. Thyatira, according to the rules of ancient warfare, could not easily be defended. It wasn't on a hill, it wasn't surrounded by a river or cliffs, it was kind of out in the open, and you could build up some earthenwork protections, but an invading army would eventually overwhelm any army that tried to take a stand in Thyatira. But you had to take a stand in Thyatira. When the people from Sardis, the army of Sardis, marched against Pergamum, it was the job of the citizens of Thyatira to stall them, to delay them, to hold them up long enough so that the army in Pergamum could get ready, call out all the reserves and fix everything. Likewise, when the army from Pergamum was going down to invade Sardis, Thyatira had to keep the army at bay long enough for the people in Sardis to get ready. So it was one of those cities where it couldn't be defended, but it had to be defended. They had to keep building it up because it was a blocking city. So that made it very, very important. Now, writing the letter to the church in Thyatira, here's what it looks like today. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. What is burnished bronze? Okay. Yeah, bronze is an alloy, and guess what they make in Thyatira besides purple? Bronze. It was famous for bronze. It was a special kind of high value bronze called burnished bronze. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but Jesus in the picture in chapter 1 pictures himself as having feet made from Thyatiran bronze. And so we have that introduction here. All right. The words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your works, your love and faith and servants and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed the first. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and eat food sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her onto a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her I will throw into great tribulation unless they repent of her works. And I will strike her children dead, and all the churches will know that I am he who searches mind and heart, and I will give to each of you according to your works. But to the rest of you in Thyatira, who do not hold this teaching, who have not learned what some call the deep things of Satan, to you I say, I do not lay on you any other burden, only hold fast what you have until I come. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. All right, here's our letter and our outline. Let's look at the different elements of it again. Number one, the introduction of Christ. Again, eyes like flaming fire, and we can see the furnace there, feet of burnished bronze. So Jesus, in that first picture, is tied in to the church in Thyatira. The commendation. What does Jesus commend them for? Look at all the good things that they're doing. Their works, their love, their faith, their service, steadfastness. Now, by the way, that patient endurance is the English Standard Version says, or the word that I used here, endurance, that's hupomone. That is the Christian patience. You've heard me preach so many times in this congregation about patience, that there are two kinds of patience in the New Testament. One, macrothumia, which is the patience that says when you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Sometimes all God expects of us is to endure the hardships. Just get through it. But the word that is used here for endurance is hupomone. And that is an endurance that thrives in the face of adversity, that's at its very best when times are at their very worst. And he says, that's the kind of church that we have here in Thyatira. You people don't just hang on and endure. You thrive in the face of the adversity, and I commend you for that. And he says, I love this, your latter deeds are greater than your first deeds. This is a church that is growing and continuing to do good works and to grow in discipleship. But there is a condemnation. That woman Jezebel. Who was Jezebel? Yeah, she was the queen who opposed the prophets. She was the one, the great promoter of Baal. She's the one who had King Ahab under her thumb. She's a wicked woman, and she's teaching wicked things. Now, she calls herself a prophetess. There are good prophetesses in the New Testament. Can you think of any prophetesses in the New Testament? You remember when Jesus was born? What's her name? Anna? Is there in the temple the woman who was in her 80s who prophesies about the baby Jesus? And then you remember Philip, the evangelist, had 4 virgin daughters who were prophetesses. So the fact that she's a woman doesn't make her an evil prophetess. It's what she's teaching. It's what she's saying. Now, what is it that she's teaching? She's teaching sexual immorality and idolatry. What? Now, we need to think about this. We need to go back to the first century. In those days, especially in Thyatira, you had to belong to a trade guild in order to work. Most towns it was that way. In the city square, there would be the different shops, and the shops represented the different trade guilds. And so in Thyatira, whether you're making burnished bronze or whether you're harvesting the Thyatiran purple, you needed to be a part of the guild in order to do business. Well, what do organizations do? They have meetings, right? I mean, we got to get together and have our meeting. And so they had temples all through this area, and they would come to the temple, and they would have their meeting at the temple, and they would have a meal at the temple, and they would worship the god at the temple. In those days, sexual immorality was a part of the worship of those gods. There were sacred prostitutes and a lot of horrible, horrible things. But if you didn't participate, then you couldn't be a part of the guild, which meant you didn't have a job, which meant you couldn't feed your family. It's a horrible predicament for Christians. Last week we talked about the church in Corinth, about eating meat sacrificed to idols. Likewise, if you participate in the meal, the fellowship meal in the temple, at the guild meeting, you are having communion with this idol. And so Christians were in a terrible predicament. And so this woman, whoever she was, Jesus called her Jezebel, and she's saying, well, an idol is nothing. I'm pretending that I understand what it was that she's teaching. I mean, I spent a lot of time. How on earth could she convince Christians to compromise in this way? Maybe she convinced them that an idol is nothing, and so you can eat this meat. It's not really communion with the idol. You have to participate in order to feed your family. God understands. I hear that a lot when I'm counseling with people. Well, God would want me to be happy. God would want me to be happy. I've heard some outrageous things. One man was in my office, and he was having an affair with a woman because he was trying to convert her. So next time use the Joe Miller film strips. This is just people do strange things in their minds. And Jesus is saying we need to take a stand. We need to take a stand. Now, I'm going to emphasize this probably more than I should, because there is such a temptation in our generation to compromise. To compromise. Atheism is overwhelming our country. Now, most people would claim to be agnostic. I'm not sure if there is or there isn't. For me, an agnostic is just a jellyfish of faith. I have more respect for an atheist who says God doesn't exist than for a guy who says, I don't know yet, I'll figure it out eventually. You know, I don't see that. And the problem with atheism is if there is no God, then there are no standards. Have you ever thought about what that means? If there are no standards of right and wrong, as a Christian, I believe that God created the world and God created the moral law within. That there are standards of right and wrong. For example, nobody has to tell you that it is wrong to murder your grandmother. That's just, you don't have to read the Bible or read the law books to know that. That's just built in. That's part of our DNA. But if you're an atheist, you say that DNA thing doesn't exist. There are no standards of right and wrong. If there are no standards of right and wrong, then growth is impossible. You cannot grow as a human being because there are no right or wrong. There's no good or evil. It just is. You're just making choices. Do you see how outrageous that is? And so as Christians, I believe there is right and wrong. There is good and evil, and that we're here on earth to grow. We're moving towards a goal, and you can measure your progress towards that goal. I hope I'm a better person today than I was yesterday, because I believe there are absolute standards. Okay, end of the sermon. That's what happens when you get the preacher to teach the Bible class. You end up getting a sermon here. All right, this woman Jezebel. Okay, she is an evil woman, and Jesus condemns her. And so Jesus gives a warning. It's actually two parts. It says, I will punish the guilty. And this will serve as a warning to others not to commit the same offenses. All right. Why do we have discipline? Well, it's not only to save the person who's lost, but also to warn other people that this is improper behavior. Discipline is a part of discipleship. All right. Exhortation. Jesus says, I will impose no other burden on you. Only hold fast to what you have until I come. Wow. Finally, the conclusion. I will give him the morning star. What is the morning star? Well, it's Venus. Venus is the morning and the evening star. But in the Bible, that's another term for describing Jesus. That if you hold fast, you will receive Jesus and all the promises. Let's go to the next city, which I think is one of the most interesting that we're going to look at. You see the hill in the background, the mountain? It used to be there was a city on top of that hill. That would be a fortress. Now, if you're a soldier with a bow and arrow, what do you think about, let's go invade that city? Well, somebody's just going to drop a rock on my head. This was an impregnable fortress. Sardis was an amazing, amazing ancient city. It was incredibly wealthy. Let me check my notes here. I'm trying to remember the name of the river that flowed in front of Sardis. The Pacolius? Yes. The Pacolius River, and this was a great river. I want you to think about this city. Not only did they have an impregnable fortress, but down at the base, there is a river that's full of gold sand. You could go down and pan for gold. And so it was at Sardis that coins were first invented. So when you reach in your pocket and you pull out a quarter, think about Sardis. They invented money. They were wealthy beyond belief. But there is a problem. In ancient history, there was Croesus. Croesus was a famous ancient king who not only invented money and so forth, but he decided to go whoop up on an enemy army. But before he did, he wanted to go and visit the prophetess, the oracle at Delphi, and see if this is what I should do. And the oracle came back, if you attack, a great empire will fall. Is that good? Well, if I was the king, I'd say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So I'm going to go attack this. And what happened? He got wiped out. He comes back and he says, I want my money back. And the prophetess said, I told you that if you attacked, a great empire would fall. I didn't tell you which empire. You know, got to read the fine print. It's always been that way. Now, the city of Sardis, you would think that this was impregnable. But because they were so secure, or they felt so secure at the top of the hill, they actually fell on two separate occasions. When the first time, one of the soldiers is watching and observing, and you've got the man who is on guard duty. And he's marching along the top of the wall, and he drops his helmet. Helmets are expensive. And I mean, they had sergeants in the old days, and he's going to really be in trouble for losing his helmet. So he climbs down a secret passageway and gets his helmet and goes back, and everything is fine, except the enemy saw the secret passageway. And so that night, they go up the inside passage, and nobody thinks that the enemy's coming, and the city falls. 200 years later, the same thing happens again. Well, let's read the letter. And to the angel of the church in Sardis write, the words of him who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. Stop for a second. 7 spirits of God? I can understand Trinity, but 7 spirits? What's that? We saw that in chapter 1, that before the throne of the 7 spirits of God. All right, remember our first key for unlocking the book of Revelation is remember the kind of literature that we're dealing with. It's like poetry. It's apocalyptic. And apocalyptic, numbers don't necessarily represent numbers. Numbers have special meaning. And so the number 3 represents God. The number 4 represents humanity, north, south, east, west, the 4 corners of the earth. And when you put God and humanity together, what do you get? Quick math majors. 4 plus 3 is 7. 7 is the number of perfection. The 7 spirits doesn't mean there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spirits. It means the perfect Spirit of God. Now, sometimes in the book of Revelation, numbers do represent numbers. For example, he's holding 7 stars in his right hand. All right, what do the 7 stars represent? The angels of the 7 churches, or it could be the ministers of the 7 churches. So here we have Jesus pictured as perfection and watching out after his church. I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. Remember then what you received and heard. Keep it and repent. If you will not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. Now, stop for a second. Do you see how that has special meaning to the church at Sardis? Remember, we said there are 2 keys for understanding Revelation. One is the kind of literature. The second one is to know the history. Now, if you knew the story of how Sardis was conquered twice because people were asleep on guard duty, the words that Jesus says, wake up or I will come when you don't expect me, do you see how that ties in? Every kid in Sardis would remember that story, and this punches home people who are there. Yet, you still have a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot out his name from the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Here's our outline again. the seven spirits, the perfect stars. Commendation, what good does he have to say about the church in Sardis? Nothing. That makes this letter stand out from all the others. There is nothing good about this church. That's kind of scary, isn't it? All right, there's nothing good. Now they appear, they live in this capital city with a river flowing with gold and fortress. They have the appearance that everything is good, but inside Jesus says, no, you're not. And so the condemnation, you have a reputation for being alive, but you're dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains. Exhortation, remember. Those are powerful words. When times are hard, remember. I've mentioned this before, that when couples come to me for marriage counseling, one of the first things I ask them to do is to bring their picture book from their wedding. You know, the one where, I don't know about you, but I had a tuxedo, and do you remember bell-bottom pants from the 70s? Yeah, we're still trying to forget those. But the great thing about a bell-bottom tuxedo is you can look at the groom, and if his knees are shaking, those pant legs are fanning the first 3 rows. It's cute. We go back and we remember the way that things were. We need to remember. Now, of course, we need to be careful when we remember, because as we'll see later on in the book of Revelation, there's a whole section about nostalgia. What's the difference between remembering and nostalgia? Nostalgia remembers the good old days. Jan and I like to watch the old TV shows. Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, My Three Sons. Why can't life be like that again? Yeah, and we think about, those were the good old days. Well, no, you remember dental care in the 50s? I can see Stan squirming there. All right. You remember dental care? Do you remember polio? Do you remember racism? You remember. And not all good things. Doesn't that rain sound good? Yeah. We need it. All right. Sometimes remembering can become nostalgia. We need to be careful of that. But Jesus says you need to wake up and remember what you did, and don't just remember it, but do the things that you did at the beginning. And yet, Jesus says in the promise, you still have a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Book of life. We'll see more about this as we go through the book of Revelation, but let me just make a really important point. Sometimes we have this picture of the judgment day, that God will be like the great accountant in the sky, with that green visor, and he rolls up his sleeves, and he looks there, and here's Richard Brenzing. And on the left side, we have the debits, and on the right side, we have the credits. And we go through and we add it all up, and if you come up with a positive balance, congratulations, Richard, it's eternal bliss. That is not the book of life. What does Jesus say? If your name is in the book of life, if your name is there, it's not an accounting of what you've already done. That judgment's already happened. If your name is there in the roll, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. It's a beautiful thought. More about that as we get farther into the book of Revelation. Let's go now to the church in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the most beautiful of the 7 churches. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write, the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one will open. What's the key of David? David had an aide who was given the key. The key was controlling access to the king. Jesus has the key with access to God. And if he gives you access to God, no one can take that away. And if he closes the door, no one can open it. So that's an important role. I know your works. Behold, I've set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Because you have kept my word about patient endurance. There's our word hupomone again. Patient endurance. I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The description, the one who has the key of David, the one who controls access to God. Commendation, I know your works. Condemnation, well, just as we saw at Sardis, they had no commendation, they only had condemnation. So we have the flip side when we come to Philadelphia. Jesus only has things of praise to say about this church. He does not condemn them for anything. So there is no warning, only an exhortation. Hold fast to what you have. And a promise, to the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of. Pause for just a second. Again, we're going to turn to the second key, and that's about the history, about the archaeology. Philadelphia was a city of temples. Temples were everywhere. But there was a problem, because Philadelphia was on a volcanic plain. Now, that volcanic plain gave them the finest grapes, the finest vineyards in the world. Their wine was known the world over. This is the best stuff. But what's the problem in living next to a volcano? Earthquakes. Earthquakes. And there was one earthquake just before this letter that was written that destroyed 12 cities, including Philadelphia. Now, those cities rebuilt, but Philadelphia didn't have the money to rebuild. So the emperor paid for rebuilding the city, and the city was very grateful to the emperor. Wow, I love that sound. All right, and so the city would be rebuilt. They were very grateful to the emperor, but still, there were nights where there would be tremors, and people would not sleep inside their homes during a tremor. In fact, they go outside of the city and sleep in the vineyards. It was a dangerous place. Now, pillars are not made out of one single piece of marble. If you look at them, they're made out of rounds that are stacked on top of each other. And what's the problem with that in an earthquake? If they're not glued together, the pillars come tumbling down, right? But Jesus says, I will make you a pillar, and that pillar is not going to fall. And on the pillars will be dedicated to people, dedicated to the Christians. That's a beautiful picture, isn't it? That God will make us pillars in his temple, and our name will be on the pillar. It's a beautiful image. Now, the one thing, what is the great blessing of the church in Philadelphia? Jesus says, I will put before you an incredible opportunity, an open door. Now, personally, I'm going to editorialize a little bit. I believe that God blesses every church, that God has given every church certain opportunities. And it is our job as a congregation to recognize what those opportunities are and to use them, to recognize the resources that God has given us and to use them. It's not for us to say, Lord, we don't want this resource, we want that resource. A few years ago, I was advising a church in New Mexico, and the average age in the congregation was about 70. Okay, that sounds like a church that's waiting to close the door, doesn't it? And so they decided we need to do something about that. And we're going to hire a new preacher, and we're going to hire a youth minister. A youth minister? And we want to hire a young preacher who's got kids. Why? So we'll have kids? You know, that's working from weakness, isn't it? What has God provided you with? A congregation of incredible experience. We need to focus on that. We need to be reaching out from a position of strength to other seniors. There are things that we can do to bring more seniors in. And as we take advantage of what God has given us, God will give us more. I don't believe that God's going to give us additional resources until we use the ones that He's already given us. Now, for the church at Philadelphia, God set before them an open door. Generally, that means an opportunity for evangelism, to send out missionaries to other places. But whatever it was, the church in Philadelphia, their job was to recognize it and take advantage of that open door and to go through it. Laodicea. Oh, okay, I'm going to have to speak a lot faster and quit editorializing. Laodicea. The church in Laodicea was established not by the Apostle Paul, but by a Christian evangelist by the name of Epaphras. Epaphras the evangelist. You can read about Epaphras in the book of Colossians. You see, Colossae is about 10 miles away from Laodicea. Laodicea had only been around for about 100 years. It was a new town. I kind of call it the San Francisco of the ancient world. It was a new place in the Lycus River Valley. It was growing. It was a frontier town. Now, 6 miles up to the north was another town by the name of Hierapolis. And Hierapolis is kind of the Palm Springs of the ancient world. You can see Hierapolis from Laodicea. There are these, if you've been to a cavern, they always have a frozen waterfall, right, where the calcium is run over a wall and it hangs there and it turns pure white. Well, so it was up at the top of the hill here were these hot springs. And the hot springs flowed over the sides of the cliffs and left calcium deposits on it so that it was white. Now, who especially is attracted to hot springs? Palm Springs is the retirement community. Why? Because you've got hot springs there. We can go and soak our old weary bones. So it was that Hierapolis was a retirement town, but Laodicea was a young, bustling town. Colossae was dying. It was past its prime. And so when we come to a letter to these three churches, it's really the letter that is written to the church in Laodicea. The one outstanding fact about Laodicea was they didn't have a good supply of water. Although they were on the Lycus wasn't a reliable source of water. It's kind of like the Colorado River now is in great danger, right? Well, the Lycus dried up, so they had to pipe their water. But the water that was piped, coming from the hot springs, well, a good hot drink, that sounds pretty good, Natural, we got a Keurig right out of the pipe. But as the water has traveled for a long ways through the pipes, the heat dissipates and it becomes lukewarm. Now, I like a nice ice-cold glass of water. That's refreshing. Or a nice, stiff, hot drink. That's refreshing. But lukewarm? No. That just makes you want to gag. It's kind of, when I was a kid, my dad used to joke about Missouri water. Anybody here from Missouri? Called it misery water. It just would make you gag. Had that sulfur in it, all right? So it was, Laodicea would make you gag. So let's conclude by reading Jesus' letter to the church in Laodicea. And to the angel of the church in Laodicea write, the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of God's creation. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm, and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I've prospered, I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich, and white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes. By the way, each of these are products of Laodicea. They were famous for their pharmaceutical industry there. They were famous for their garment industry that was there, and these other things. Jesus says, you think you've got them, you need to get the real stuff, the genuine stuff from me. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. So be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Again, at our outline, commendation. Jesus has nothing good to say about this church. They had all the appearances, just like Sardis, of being wealthy and powerful with opportunities. But Jesus says it's not so. You're just lukewarm. And so the warning, I'll spit you out of my mouth. Exhortation, buy from me what you need. Jesus provides a way for the Laodiceans to return to him through discipline. For those who learn from that discipline, he promises the privilege of sitting on his throne alongside of him. And notice the promise is conditional. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, if we don't open that door, if we don't wake up and listen, then we receive the punishment. But if you open the door, I will go in and eat with him and he with me. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I hope you've enjoyed this series on the 7 churches of Asia. Next week, we enter the throne room of God. We have another one of those apocalyptic visions this next week. Come back and be with us.